The British Broadcasting Corporation has got into a controversy. Known to be a very quote-unquote trustworthy organization, it's very ironical and interesting that it's got into a controversy of tax evasion. Before we get into the tax evasion aspect of it, let us look at 3 or 4 different angles of the BBC, its vision, the structure, the kind of a tax evasion or the avoidance issue that we are getting to see, and finally the agenda part of it. First and foremost, BBC is an organ of the British government, and the British government, with its mindset that Churchill probably endorsed so well, the white man's burden. If independence were to be given to India, the power will go to the rogues, something to this effect Churchill spoke of, and it will be led by men of straw. He had no regard for the Indian leadership, for the Indian people. This is broadly the white man's burden that believes that people of color are incapable of governing themselves, are uncivilized, and it's the white man that has to take care of this responsibility, and hence the white man's burden. The BBC subtly, unconsciously, or probably overtly and covertly takes this vision ahead. It acts as a mouthpiece of this British mindset across the globe, setting a narrative, setting an agenda. That is BBC for you. Now the structure. It's so easy for all of us to assume that the BBC UK is the same as BBC India, but that's not the case. You have a web of companies. You have the BBC, the main body, under which you have the BBC Commercial Holdings, under which you have 2 subsidiaries. One is the BBC World News Limited, the other is BBC Worldwide Limited. Under the BBC Worldwide Limited, you have the BBC Worldwide India Private Limited. So you get to see some 4 or 5 different companies in place. You get to see a lot of interactions happening between the related party companies. This is where the real crux of the issue is. Income of a company less the expenditure becomes its profits. I'm putting it in very simple terms, and that will be subjective to the tax. If it's a single entity company, it's so easy that you get to see what the income are, you get to see what the expenditures are, and therefore income less expenditures becomes your profit, and the tax on profit needs to be paid to the government. If there were to be some crooked mindset business, what would they do? They would want to suppress the income, show lesser income, and show higher expenditure, and therefore say that the profits are very, very low or zero or probably negative. That is, they are running a loss. Now you might ask, how is this possible? The income and the expenditure are fairly visible, fairly evident. Here lies the crux. If there are 4 or 5 companies, then you can start interacting amongst yourselves, which is known as the related party transaction. Ideally, there should be at a arm's length pricing, which means if you were to buy a particular good from a related party company, it should be at the same quality and the same price, which otherwise you would have bought it from the outside market. But if you're going to pay more money to the internal party, related party, then that means to say there is something which is not fair, which is something fishy. Now the tax authorities have been looking at this aspect, the lack of ALP, arm's length pricing, in the British Broadcasting Corporation's interrelated companies. You have been paying off more amount of money as expenditure for which the activity is happening elsewhere and not in India. This is primarily to bump up your expenses and lessen your profit and therefore the tax liability. This is what the tax authorities are pinpointing. Okay, fair enough. You have the BBC, which has a vision of a white man's burden. Then you have their interrelated structures. Then you are looking at the tax evasion part of it and the tax avoidance part of it. We'll come to it a bit later. But why is it that you're doing it now? Now, as in, there was a documentary being made by the BBC about the 2002 issues in Gujarat. And suddenly a few days down the line, the income tax department go to the offices, visit the offices of the BBC. Why do you have to do it now? Is the common man's question. The answer is simple. The government, the court and the IT departments generally are known, wrongly or rightly, are known to have a very, very long gestation period in terms of closing a case. So this is not a new case wherein the IT department went to the offices of the BBC. It's an old case that pertains to the year 2003-2004. raked up in the year 2006, brought to one level in 2010, once again escalated and appealed in the year 2014, and since then been in the court and the IT authorities. So the process has been on for the past 18-20 years. So this is not something that came up suddenly because there was a documentary being aired. If anything, it's an ongoing normal process, and if anything, the IT authorities and the High Court will decide what is the total tax liability. Media reports peg it at about 40 crore rupees, 40 crore rupees of tax evasion. Meaning you have to not only pay the back taxes, but you also need to pay a penalty on that. Now you need to ask this counter question to the BBC guys. 2002, certain tragic situation happened in Gujarat. You're airing 1 year before the general elections in India. What does that mean? Does that mean there is an agenda for you? This issue has been dealt by the court, subordinate, High Court as well as the Supreme Court of India. And the Supreme Court of India has given a very clear, clean chit to the Modi government with respect to the 2002 engagement, the way they handled the whole crisis. Now what is your agenda, BBC, to rake this up and air this 1 year before? Before I forget, the lot of Sikh organizations in the UK have made a formal representation, protested against BBC's exclusion of Asian religion like Sikhism and Hinduism predominantly, as in giving them a very small airtime when compared to, let's say, Islam. This has been a Sikh organization's formal complaint in the year 2010 itself. And more so, the intent of the BBC was never to get these people into the mainstream, but to ghettoize them. That's what the complaint further states. So with these things being in place, it is something very clear, a so-called trustworthy organization like the BBC, unfortunately, has itself become an organization full of suspicion. It's up to the BBC now to clear its name and to tell the whole world that it is not agenda driven. Over to you, BBC.